Welcome to Talk with Toni. We've had a number of county commissioners and county elected officials as guests, and today our guest is Fritz Kaegi, who's the assessor of Cook County. You took that position in 2018, and of course, you've been in it now for 3 years. So you've got a kind of sense of the office. But before we talk about that, let's talk about how you kind of got to this point. What's the trajectory that brought you to the assessor's office?
Sure. So my life, I was someone who was involved in investing before, and I invested around the world. But also, I went to Kenwood Academy in Hyde Park, and I had a lot of classmates who owned homes in the middle of the financial crisis. They were at the age they were buying homes in the early 2000s, and they were hit by the financial crisis when the housing crash happened. And I saw the experiences of my classmates where they had housing prices that fell, their homes were underwater with mortgages, but sometimes their tax bills went up. And it caused me to learn about the assessment system. And so I took my background as someone who looked at markets, who looked at how things are valued, and saw how it was connected with our assessment system, which is really about equity. So
it's the result of your classmates' experience with the housing crisis at the beginning of the century and into 2008, 2009, that brought you to your interest in assessment processes.
That's right, because assessments are literally about equity. In our state, we decide how much money needs to be raised to fund all of our taxing agencies first, and then we divide up that cost of government amongst all the property owners through the assessment process. And so everyone's assessment is interconnected in this process, and so I saw how if our assessment system got off kilter, if parts of it got distorted, that could lead to really harmful consequences on people like my classmates and other people I knew, and really people who are black and brown. Usually they have more of their savings invested in their home, so it has a disparate impact on them when the system's not working right.
Okay, and just so that people understand, the assessment process is a county process. Every county has an assessor that determines property values. And the money comes to entities that are local. So it comes to cities and villages and towns. It comes to school districts. It comes to the Metropolitan Water Reclamation, whatever. Mm-hmm. The state is funded differently. Property taxes don't come to the state. They fund local units of government.
That's right. So most of our property taxes that we pay are for educating our children. It's about 2/3 of the costs of your property tax bill, and our school districts and municipalities in the county, they generate how much money they need. They say it's about $16 billion in Cook County every year this year. It grows a little bit every year. And then we use assessments to divide up that cost of government amongst all the property owners. And it's important that assessments be this mirror to the market, because that's the standard for fairness. And the more that mirror gets distorted, the more some end up paying more than they should and others less. And there are many different kinds of inequity. You've talked in your series about we have many different layers of inequity in society, but we don't want assessments to add on a further inequity to what's already there.
Okay, and there are lots of different kinds of property. Why don't you talk about that?
Sure. So there are nearly 2 million parcels in Cook County. We're the largest market-based jurisdiction in the United States, the second biggest county, but the biggest county, LA, uses Prop 13. And there are about 1.5 million of those are single-family homes, including condominiums of all shapes and sizes. And then we have many different kinds of industrial and commercial properties. And commercial properties are extremely diverse. It's from the neighborhood corner store to a big shopping mall. It can also include data centers, skyscrapers, bowling alleys. It's extremely diverse. And then we have manufacturing, which is also very diverse in its own right.
Okay, so manufacturing is industrial property. Commercial can be anything from rental property to downtown buildings,
yes,
office buildings, okay?
Yep.
And then residential is homeowners, and it could be single-family homes, it could be townhouses, it could be condominiums.
Right, and all the homes are so different. Think about all the different homes for the people that we know, all the different neighborhoods that we know, and we need assessments to be reflective of the unique circumstances in each neighborhood, so that the system isn't distorted and some people don't pay more than they should.
All right, so what were the challenges you faced when you came in the office, and how have you tried to address them?
Well, there are a lot of challenges that we find in the assessment system are things where it might seem like it's impartial, but there's actually a bias built in. I'll give you an example from commercial properties and from residential properties. In commercial properties, a lot of the data that we have about commercial properties are sort of broad averages. So maybe it might be for a single-story retail property, and if we just use an average value for a single-story retail property across the south side, many different corridors in the south side are different, and that could lead to overassessment of a more humble, smaller commercial property and maybe underassessment of a larger commercial property. So that's one of the kinds of problems that we confronted. Same thing with homes. If we're just looking at averages for single-family homes and aren't really sensitive to what's going on in that neighborhood or for that kind of building, again, it can lead to overassessment of the more humble homes or lower price homes, and it can lead to underassessment of the overpriced homes, of the more expensive homes. And that can mean really harmful consequences for people who can least afford it. The people who own the lowest value homes can end up paying a higher rate if we're not careful. So what we've really tried to do is make sure that we're using models that don't have that kind of bias built into them. We try to have more richer data so that we can see the differences better. For example, between a store that might be on 53rd Street versus 43rd Street, which are close to each other, but they're very different. And also making sure that we're using data that don't have any other biases in the process. And then lastly, we have to make sure that the processes that we use in the office for appeals, for outreach, don't end up generating biases of their own. So what we've really tried to do is try to focus on how do we think the mirror that we're supposed to be the market got distorted, and then how can we eliminate this distortion so that's fairer for everyone?
Okay, I think the simplest analogy is, all of us have been in a fun house, and the mirror, makes you wider or makes you taller or whatever. So what you're trying to do is make sure that there's a realistic image in the mirror, right?
That's right, and it's a doubly important consequence for people, because it's not only their annual tax bill, but if your annual tax bill is too high, it impacts the worth of your whole home and the wealth that you've had. So if you're paying $1,000 per year more than you should be paying, that can mean a $15,000 perhaps impact on your wealth, which is huge. That's about the average wealth for a black family in America. So fixing these distortions can have a really big impact on people's annual bills, but also on their wealth. And that's why it's so important to me.
All right. We know that black and brown people, most of their wealth is equity in their homes.
Yes, that's right.
So what you're suggesting is that assessments have a disproportionate impact on black and brown people regardless, because this is the principal source of family wealth.
That's exactly right. The Fed has found that black and brown families, of the wealth that they have, which tends to be much lower than it is for white families, but
right.
Of the wealth they have, it's more focused on real estate, so they have more at stake. And actually, it's even bigger than that, because many people have a mortgage, so they can really benefit if we fix this process, because they can gain more equity, but also if the system has not been serving them, it can have a powerful downward effect. So that's why there's so much at stake in fixing the system. Okay.
We have a system where properties are assessed triennially, every 3 years.
Right.
Okay, and we're in the midst of the Chicago triennial, is that right?
Yes, that's correct. You've got it right.
All right, so help us, so what does that mean?
So what it means is we're really starting to hit the stride of what we've been working on since we came into office. So the first year we came into office, we reassessed the northern suburbs. That's the schedule that the state gave us. Last year we reassessed the western and south suburbs. And this year we're reassessing Chicago. So only at the end of this year will we have had a chance to reassess all of Cook County in our administration. And the further wrinkle is it only affects Chicagoans' tax bills next year. But what we've been able to do is show that in the first 2 years where we did reassess the suburbs, we had much larger reductions in those biases between lower-end homes and higher-end homes, and lower-end commercial properties and higher-end commercial properties. But we've also done it in a way that by eliminating those biases, it helped homeowners. The average residential property tax bill in Cook County only increased 1% each year, which is slower than the growth in overall spending.
Okay, so this is the Chicago triennial, which means
Yes.
we're looking at Chicago properties, but the system charges you property taxes 1 year after the services are incurred, if you want to put it that way.
Right.
So how does that work?
So for complex historical reasons, which we need not go into, we start the process of assessments this year, and people get an opportunity because we are about 250 people trying to assess almost 2 million properties. People get the opportunity to say, hey, you didn't get this right, and that's the appeals process. So we send out an assessment, people get a chance to appeal with us. We do this throughout the whole giant city of Chicago, which is about 1 million properties. And when we're done, then there's a whole other appeals process that operates at the Board of Review, which is another Cook County body, which gives people another chance to make sure that they've been served properly. And only after that process is done can we finally say assessments are ready to determine each person's share of the property tax bill, which will be next year. So it's a complex process, but it gives people a due process, and it is in a system as big as ours. This is the system that we have, and we have to make it work.
All right. It's a complicated process,
Yes.
And historically it's been a controversial process.
Yes.
Okay. What do you attribute the controversy?
Well, the controversy is that I think that our system has been so big that it's been hard to manage. And I think many processes, such as some of the books that I brought today, even going back to the 70s and earlier, tended to build in some of these biases that we were just talking about, where lower end homes tended to be assessed more highly than the higher end homes, which tended to be under-assessed. This has been a problem that's been around for a long time.
For decades.
For decades. So that's one problem. The second problem is, for a long time, people didn't think that this process was done out in the open with transparency. People didn't understand where's this number coming from? I don't understand if I'm getting a fair shake. And so we had a culture in Cook County for a long time of assuming the number was wrong and feeling like you had to appeal to get halfway of a fair shake. Our system tried to gather data through the appeals process. And the problem with that is that the appeals process can cater to people who have more wealth. It caters to people who have knowledge of the system. It caters to people who speak English and aren't intimidated by all this legalese. And that has a disparate impact on folks of more modest means, especially Black and brown people. So what's really important, what we set our lodestar by, is how are we doing for the average person who doesn't appeal? Because once the appeals process sets in motion, the system as a whole, it can be a little bit more inequitable each time we add in the appeals process. So we really want to focus on getting it right the first time and doing it out in the open in a way that builds trust. This distrust has been there for a long time, and we're trying many different ways through transparency, through outreach, through providing better information, better data, better services to build trust in the system. This is something that our peers in the rest of the U.S. are ahead of us on, but we can learn from them, and we can do this. This is something that's possible.
Okay. Now, you were good enough, the teacher appreciates this, you were good enough to bring some books. Why don't you tell us a little bit about those, because they're all, as you said, Chicago-focused.
Sure. So for everyone out there, you can check out our series. We've had a racial equity and real estate series where we can bring together different groups who care about economic equity, who care about housing markets, who care about education, who care about other aspects of this problem, to learn about these things. And we have several different books that we've been reading and discussing. Race for Profit is by Keeanga Yamada Taylor. She's a professor at Princeton, and she did her dissertation at Northwestern. And she looked at how, since the end of the era of redlining, there are other kinds of new predatory kinds of wealth extraction systems in real estate that tended to predate on Black and brown people through expensive lending, through other processes through predatory brokerage practices, panic peddling, other things that sort of tended to hurt Black and brown people when they bought homes. And she's in one of the panels that folks out there can catch on Zoom. The South Side is by Natalie Moore. She's a reporter for WBEZ, and it's a story about Chatham and other parts of the South Side and how they changed over the 70s and 80s when she was growing, 70s, 80s, and 90s when she was growing up. And for Chicagoans, this will be an interesting story to see how our neighborhoods are changing and how we're confronting the problem of segregation. Family properties is a story about, it's really important in West Side history. It's about contract buying. This was a kind of predatory buying of real estate because black and brown people did not have access to federal mortgage guarantees in the same way that white people did. And contract buying was an exploitative way of selling homes. And the Contract Buyers League, about which this book is about, it helped to lead to the Community Reinvestment Act, which expanded access to mortgages in the U.S. And then the color of the law.
Mortgages for people of color.
Mortgages for people of color, that's right. And then the color of law is by Richard Rothstein, and it's about many different systems of unequal access to federal mortgage infrastructure, to a government-enforced segregation, to the way we built highways, and how that tended to reinforce inequity. And it talks a lot about Chicago. All of these are books that people can read about. And when we talked about it with our employees at the agency, when we talked about these books, the thing that was really great was that people in their families oftentimes have this history that they might not know about. And oftentimes people don't want to talk about issues of money, but it sort of triggered conversations that people could have, realizing that there were things that affected them, that touched them, that they can help to understand better by understanding some of the works here that people wrote about Chicago.
All right. Well, thank you very much for sharing what's going on in the assessor's office and the assessment process, and giving us some reading.
Okay.
Reading assignments. Huh?
Well, I do want to respect the teacher, so I thought you'd enjoy it.
All right. Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us for Talk with Toni.
Thank you.